Sponsored by New Orleans Distillers, creators of fine spirits and liqueurs. Through dedication to science, art, and passion, blends of tradition and flavor emerge. For you, always locally crafted. New Orleans Distillers, classically Southern.
Tonight, Costco is limiting certain products like toilet paper due to supply chain disruptions. The CDC is overruling the advisors and now saying a booster vaccine will be needed. And just how bad was Hurricane Ida? That and more tonight, all on Wall Street Wrap-Up. Hi, and welcome to Wall Street Wrap-Up. I hope your week went well. I'm Andre Laborde. Our goal is bringing Wall Street to your street for today, for Friday, September the 24th, 2021, and to get you ready for the week ahead. Well, when we were last together a few weeks ago, I ended the show with, "I'll see you next week. We'll be here." Well, I never expected Hurricane Ida to get between you and I. Well, tonight we'll be discussing the hurricane, as well as energy, utilities, and much more with Louisiana's Public Service Commissioner, Eric Skrmetta. Eric represents 11 parishes in southeast Louisiana, and his constituents represent a large portion of those that were affected by Hurricane Ida. And we'll be talking with Eric Skrmetta in just a minute. But first, how did the markets do this week? Well, it was a seesaw on Wall Street this week, with the market dropping at the very beginning of the week due to a Chinese real estate company missing their bond payments. But as the days progressed, more buyers entered the market than left it. The Dow Jones Industrial Average ended the week at 34,797, up 32 points for the day and up 0.6 of a point for the week. And the S&P 500 closed today at 4,455, up 6.5 points for the day and up 0.5% for the week. And finally, the NASDAQ. They finished the week at 15,047, down 4.5 points for the day and basically flat for the week. And the Dow Jones snapped a 3-week losing streak, and the S&P 500, they snapped a 2-week losing streak. And by the way, this week, Credit Suisse is raising Walt Disney Company to an outperform with a new price target at $218 a share. And Netflix has been given a new higher price target by JP Morgan Chase. Their new price target, $700 a share. Well, my guest this evening is Eric Skrmetta. Eric is the Public Service Commissioner of District 1 in Louisiana. And as Commissioner of the southeast portion of Louisiana, his constituents felt the brunt of Cat 4 Hurricane Ida. And he's here with us tonight to tell us on just how bad things have and how well things have progressed. Hi, Eric. Welcome to Wall Street Wrap-Up.
Well, thank you, Andre. Thanks for the invitation to speak with you tonight.
Well, it's my pleasure. I know you've been quite busy for the last couple of weeks. Eric, you're now in your third term as a commissioner with the Public Service Commission, and you've seen a lot of storms. How does Hurricane Ida stack up with as far as devastation as compared to some of the others that you've been representing District 1 with?
Well, I think it goes beyond my representation. Ida, realistically, is, other than flooding, Ida is, without a doubt, the worst storm I've ever seen in my entire life. We are well beyond the destruction that took place during Hurricane Katrina. Hurricane Katrina was in the 15 to 18,000 poles destroyed through the state. Ida is closer to 30,000 plus and counting. Poles destroyed, tremendous amount of transmission damage. But at the same time, we went out to about 1,100,000 people were without power. And after the time period since we've had the storm, we were very quickly, within a few weeks, to get them back to just about 14,000 people right now are without power. And we are working very aggressively to get those who can take power to receive power.
So after approximately 3 weeks from the storm, there are still people in this area that are still without power?
Well, it's predominantly along the Gulf Coast and the coastal regions. Grand Isle was particularly hard hit, the area around Fourchon, Louisiana. And then as you move westward between Thibodaux, Labadeville, into the Bayou country is where it sustained the most significant damage. But most areas in the peripheral regions around the storm have been restored except for a few hotspots.
I see. Are there ways, Eric, to be able to have electric poles like the kind you were talking about that were so devastated because of the storm, to be able to withstand Hurricane Cat 2, 3, or 4 type winds? If I know they may not have wood,
right. Well, all of the infrastructure is put into place where they are done to withstand as much as possible. We are replacing poles that have outlived their useful life, and we replace them with poles that have greater durability and ability to withstand. But as you can imagine, very little withstands a Category 5 hurricane, Category 4. And we're looking and engaging with meteorologists that said that even though the winds were Category 4 of Hurricane Ida at surface level, some of them at higher levels were actually closer to Category 5 and beyond. So we have to deal with the fact that some things are not can't withstand everything. And if you think about it, if you just put a single pole up, it pretty much can withstand any wind issues. But when you string wires on it, it effectively becomes a sail. And so that is the problem with these issues, is that you can build a system, but systems inherently can fail. But the key to this is resiliency. And our goal is to make sure that resiliency is the ability of a system to bounce back as quickly as possible. And with the metro area and essentially losing 8 transmission lines, which were all of the transmission systems into the area, and in 4 days, rebuilding that transmission system, rebuilding the ability to have an adequate power supply to supply the entire region, and then beginning to distribute that power is actually a significant event and recovery effort. And so it performed well.
That's true. In fact, you bring up something that's interesting. I remember you and I were talking right after the storm that it would be one thing for the 8 transmission lines. It would be one thing if 1 or 3 or even 4 of them were knocked down. But in this particular, I guess to use this phrase, a perfect storm, that all 8 were knocked down, which created the massive blackouts that occurred.
Correct.
Yeah.
Effectively, we lost all sources of power into the region. A lot of people put attention on that one tower that came down by Avondale, but that was just one part of the redundancy of the system. But we lost all of it. And so where we moved to is a reconnection of the system by building a linear plan between effectively what is Waterford Power Plant, Waterford Natural Gas, and Waterford Nuclear, through the 9 Mile plant by the UEP Long, back through the New Orleans power plant, and interconnecting to the east through Southern companies, which are particularly not in our market, but they came to our assistance with great help and put together a linear mechanism. Because one of the problems is if you do not have enough power to supply the whole region and you only supplied a small amount of power, you would end up being in a situation where you would have rolling blackouts. And that would be more disruptive to the system, and particularly to residential homeowners, than it would be to stabilize the system, get enough power, and make sure that once the power is fed, that it would be stable and it would stay stable. And that was an important element to achieve. You can look at the fact that...
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, it's important to know that right after 4 days, because of the storm going in west of Kenner and to really between Laplace and more or less Sorrento, that we had to recover from Baton Rouge towards the center and from New Orleans east towards the center. And so St. Bernard came up within 4 days. We moved through New Orleans east in about 4 days. And the critical infrastructure we were getting in that 4, 5, 6 day window, where we're getting hospitals up, the government facilities that are required to be restored. And very quickly, we got more movement. Now, I live in Metairie, and I got power on day 9, about 10 o'clock at night. So we kept moving through that area. But from where we got to the basically Causeway area, we made giant leaps after day 10, where we started leaping towards the west. The hardest hit areas began really in the Destrehan, St. Charles Parish area, and took the most effort because of tree debris, and most of the poles are down. So it wasn't really a repair of the system, it was a reconstruction of the system. So that is what's going on in southern Louisiana, where they're not really repairing it, they are rebuilding the entire system.
Because of the fact that other trees were coming down, and because those poles strung energy lines, when the trees came down, that pulled the poles down, or I guess disconnected the wiring. So that had to be
Sure.
reconnected
I mean,
as well.
some of these trees we've seen come down are hundreds of years old, and big oak trees and weigh hundreds of tons. I mean, they're massive, as well as, particularly on the North Shore, millions of pine trees came down. And they are, I jokingly refer to pine trees as house killers. And when they come down, they will cut a house in half. They'll destroy it. In fact, in Katrina, one pine tree cut my mother and father's home in half.
Prior to Hurricane Ida, I know that Entergy and possibly also, correct me if I'm wrong, CLECO, was asking for a $5 surcharge for the prior storms to be paying, to be put on ratepayers. And that was before Hurricane Ida. I'm curious, will this surcharge be approved? And if it is, will Ida be included in the surcharge that's being requested now, or will there be another surcharge to help pay for the cost incurred for this storm?
Well, what we have to look at is the difference between Entergy New Orleans, Entergy Louisiana. CLECO are all different in their storm recovery seeking. And there is no set amount. The $5 amount, I think, is probably interpreted by people who wanted to come up with a number. Mm-hmm. But we haven't really studied it. We are actually beginning that process. We started today at the Public Service Commission meeting, actually starting on the 2020 storm issues, and we'll begin our study. And our studies are extensive. They may take months, and it could take a year before we even get to it. So the general rule of thumb is that companies spend their money to fix the system. They borrow the money, and they have a right under federal law to recover amounts that are just and reasonable for what they're sought to accomplish. And that's a United States Supreme Court standard. So we look to make sure that what they spent the money on was just, reasonable, that they didn't misspend, that they didn't do this. And normally we find that there are certain amounts that we cut back on this. That is separate from Hurricane Ida. Now, Hurricane Ida, simply on Entergy Louisiana alone, believe the ask right now is it's not even an accurate ask, but it's a rough estimate of it being north of $2 billion. And Entergy New Orleans, I believe they're talking about in the $100 million range. So it's a big difference, as you can see, because the magnitude of disaster was in the Entergy Louisiana footprint. Mm-hmm. So that's where the bigger costs are going to be associated with this.
Because there's Entergy Louisiana that serves all except Orleans Parish, New Orleans, and there's Entergy New Orleans that is specifically solely for Orleans Parish. Correct?
Correct. It is its own jurisdiction, mm-hmm. and that is regulated by the City Council of New Orleans. Mm-hmm. But it has a much lower storm damage associated with it because it was further east of the storm, and so it had much less damage associated to it. When you get further west, much more damage. Our concerns are that we want to make sure that the public is treated with a balance of equality, and that rural electric cooperatives are not given an advantage over investor-owned utilities, because it doesn't make a tremendous amount of difference to the companies. It makes a difference to the actual customers.
We're talking, if you're just joining us, with Eric Skrmetta. Eric is the Commissioner of District 1, Louisiana Public Service Commission, talking about Hurricane Ida and a number of other items. We'll be right back right after this. We're talking, if you're just joining us, with Eric Skrmetta. He's Commissioner of District 1 of the Louisiana Public Service Commission. Eric, before we left for a break, you had just started talking about the Stafford Act, and that was a good segue because I wanted to find out, too, that right now there's an infrastructure bill that, and I'm talking about the now I'm not talking as of yet about the so-called $3.5 trillion bill that is being talked about in the Senate. But there's one that's right now in the House that was a bipartisan Senate vote that is like $1.6 trillion, that it's being called the infrastructure bill. Do you have any ideas, or have you seen any readout of that bill of what monies would be going toward Louisiana when it comes to infrastructure?
I have not. My understanding is, except for the fact that I know we were due a certain amount of money under return of fuel taxes, I think it was approximately $14 billion. And I could be wrong on the amount because I'm not privy to the full, but I think that there was a differential of adding $1 or $2 billion more to what we were due to receive anyway in the completion of that bill.
Well, you were talking right before we went into a break about the Stafford Act, and explain to our viewers, what is the Stafford Act, and how would that be associated with residents and here in the Louisiana area?
Sure. At the best of my recollection, it's the Robert Stafford Disaster and Recovery Act. Mm-hmm. And the reason we're trying to expand it is during Hurricane Sandy, which was a Category 1 storm that impacted New Jersey and New York, elements of the Stafford Act were applied to utilities there and expanded money to investor-owned utilities in a de facto manner. And that reduced the impact on ratepayers who were customers of investor-owned utilities. And we think that that was a reasonable action for the federal government to do. We also think that that's a reasonable action for the federal government to not only expand it for the purposes of Louisiana, but to expand it for the purposes of the nation.
So the Stafford Act would not be pertaining to this, but maybe with either a waiver or an executive order, the Stafford Act could then be pertaining to this type of a storm?
Correct. The Stafford Act can be changed to include this action. And it's not just the storm, it's basically to allow coverage under the Stafford Act, which works with FEMA, and it's a FEMA-related act, that would allow investor-owned utilities to receive revenue from the federal government, which would offset the demands necessary of those companies that would have to take place from ratepayers instead. So it's a reasonable action to take care of the state, to take care of the citizens in the state, and put us in a position to provide a secure line of maritime transport, a secure line of electrons, a secure line of petrochemicals to the rest of the country that does not have the values and the wealth that we have in our state.
The Biden administration wants to reduce or do away completely with fossil fuels and rely a lot more on solar power, rely on wind power, other things such as, and I think you alluded a little bit earlier, like California. But along with that came rolling blackouts. Have you been feeling, and the other commissioners been feeling any pressure from Washington about wanting, or maybe the energy companies feeling pressure to reduce their dependence on fossil fuels and to put more emphasis on solar and wind power?
I think what we're seeing is not a reduction of all fossil fuels. There seems to be a general consensus that basically what I would call punitive fines of the EPA and other federal agencies through actions of what's called the MAP, which is the Mercury Protocols, and other issues which were waived under the Trump administration, have come back and caused the cost of coal generation of electricity to be rising. And so there is a federal regulatory push, which is causing some prices of certain kinds of electricity to go up. And then you see a movement in Louisiana to minimize or eliminate the little bit of coal power we have. We are largely 78% or more natural gas. And we can still manage the natural gas component by adding industrial scale solar to a balancing level, which can offset some of the concerns of the federal government. It's not a system that can replace it. It is something that can support the use of fossil fuels at this time. I think it's a long journey to even eliminate coal in this country. At any given day, I can look at the market that we're in, which is basically the center of the country from Manitoba, Canada to the Gulf of Mexico. And on any given day, we're using 50% of the power in the center part of the United States comes from coal. And that's not from Louisiana, that's from north of Missouri. And so that is predominantly coal country. And so the problem is it is a difficult thing to do because electricity that it comes from renewable resources is difficult to store, it's difficult to dispatch, and it's difficult to rely on. And that's what happened in Texas in February because the availability of that power fell off. Louisiana doesn't have that problem because we have a greater balance in natural gas and some nuclear and a few other things. We've got a couple of hydro plants. We are building out some solar, but Texas went the other way. And Texas had another interesting element that its regulators of its area, which was called ERCOT, were very, I don't think any of them were from Texas. And so that was a real problem from them. So things have changed drastically. They are trying to rebuild their system as far as their oversight and regulatory component. But they made their decisions on how they were going to do their business. And it made a big difference because in our price of fuel, when we had our issues in February with the winter storm, we might have gone from an average price of natural gas at that time was about $3. Right now it's closer to $4.50 with more federal regulatory constraints. But at that time it was about $3.50. We got up to about $12 to $14. In Texas, it went to $3,000. And there was a lot of open market, what I would call manipulation there. And we're investigating it still to understand the real impact on that. But they had some counties there whose annual budget was consumed for power in 1 week. And so there's a real complicated issue that is probably more significant than the Enron issue, and that's going to be coming further down the road. But it's a terrible thing. And what we have to remember, and I think Congressman Crenshaw of Texas, elaborated on this by saying that renewables are not reliable. And that's true, simply because sometimes the wind doesn't blow, sometimes the sun doesn't shine. And until such time as they develop storage mechanisms that are reliable and can do the job, then we're in a position to where we have to rely on real dispatchable power for industry, for commercial activity, and for residences.
Eric, great way to end it. We've only scratched the surface, but I hope you come back.
Well, good luck to you, Andre.
Thanks so much. Eric Skrmetta, District 1 Public Service Commissioner. Thanks, Eric. Well, in other business news this week, advisors to the CDC recommended that the U.S. administer Pfizer booster shots to people 65 years and older. Included with that, people ages 50 to 64 with underlying health conditions and nursing home residents as long as it's been at least 6 months since their second Pfizer dose. The net worth of U.S. households rose to a record $141 trillion in the second quarter of 2021. That's up almost 20% according to a recent Federal Reserve study. The unprecedented rise in net worth reflects two defining trends of the U.S. economy. One is a surging stock market, and the other, a white-hot housing market. Of the $5.8 trillion increase in net worth, the stock market accounted for $3.5 trillion, and the real estate appreciation was responsible for $1.2 trillion of that. Higher net worth also came with a big surge in IOUs. Household debt jumped 7.9%, almost 8% in the second quarter of this year, a more rapid pace than in previous quarters. Well, If you've got a question about finance or a comment about the show, we'd love to hear from you. You can always write us at andre@wallstreetwrapup.info. Keep it pithy or concise. We'll be glad to answer your questions. And now for a look ahead for next week. But first, for whom was the Mercedes automobile named for? We'll have that answer in just a moment. Well, for whom is the Mercedes automobile named? Mercedes Dahmer, the daughter of German automaker Gottlieb Dahmer. And Costco has said it will be limiting consumers' purchases of items including toilet paper, also paper towels and bottled water, due to the supply chain issues and demands generated by the rise in the Delta variant. Well, in the weeks ahead, we've got some great guests. We'll be talking with Chairman of Forbes Communication and publisher of Forbes magazine, Steve Forbes. Also, in the coming month of October, we'll be having the President of the National Urban League, Mark Morial. Also, in the events of Afghanistan and the suicide attacks, we're going to be talking with Eric Prince. Now, you may not know his name, but Eric was a former Navy SEAL, and after getting out of the Navy, he founded a security company called Blackwater, which had furnished security for the CIA, the State Department, ambassadors, and governments around the world. Eric Prince told me that he's a little busy right now in the events of Afghanistan. He's trying to get some people out, but he'll be glad to join us and explain what's ahead for Afghanistan, for terrorism, and for the United States. Eric Prince will be joining us in just a couple of weeks. Well, next week, we'll be talking with financial advisor and Morgan Stanley Managing Director Jim Spiro. Jim was picked by Barron's as one of the top 100 financial advisors in the country. And Forbes magazine picked Jim as the best state financial advisor of 2021. Jim Spiro will be here next week. We'll also repeat the show on Sunday mornings, but the best way is to set your DVR so you'll never miss an episode. And, well, that's our show for Friday, September the 24th, 2021. Hope you've enjoyed it. My thanks again to Commissioner Eric Skrmetta for joining us this evening. But as always, my special thanks is for you for allowing us into your homes tonight. Remember, you can always follow us on Facebook and WYES.org. So have a great and safe weekend and an even better week ahead. I'll see you next week. Hopefully, if there's not another Ida. For Wall Street Wrap-Up, I'm Andre Laborde. And remember, money never sleeps. Good night.
Sponsored by New Orleans Distillers, creators of fine spirits and liqueurs. Through dedication to science, art, and passion, blends of tradition and flavor emerge. For you, always locally crafted. New Orleans Distillers, classically Southern.